over the months to come. 8:25, it's not much more than a month before the World Cup starts in Qatar. Might the world's attention help a Scottish engineer facing a prison sentence there after racking up a small bank debt? Brian Glendinning is fighting extradition to Qatar after being arrested by Interpol in Iraq last month. We can speak now to Radha Stirling, founder of IPEX, an NGO seeking to reform Interpol and the extradition process more generally. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Tell us about Brian's case, because this is an interesting one.
Brian took out a loan when he was working in Qatar. He left the company due to illness when he returned back to the United Kingdom. He continued to maintain correspondence with the bank, and he had been making repayments. Unbeknownst to him, they actually convicted him in absentia and sentenced him to 2 years in prison. And then an Interpol warrant was issued against him, and when he arrived in Iraq to take up a new position, he's a construction engineer, it was told to him that he's on the Interpol Red Notice database, which was quite shocking, and that he faced extradition to Qatar to serve the sentence.
Having been convicted in absentia, so presumably without a right to defend himself?
Absolutely no right to defend himself, and he wouldn't be able to do anything about it from abroad. He'd have to be in the country to even appeal it, and he wouldn't be given the opportunity. If extradited to Qatar, he would face that 2 years in prison, but he'd also be put on a travel ban after that, and he wouldn't be able to leave the country until the debt was fully paid, which will now be 2 or 3 times the amount that they originally claimed. And he wouldn't be able to work to pay off the debt either. So it's very counterproductive, and it's used by the banks as a method of extortion. They wait for people to get arrested, and this is not the first case we've seen. We've seen many British nationals arrested in Italy and Spain, and the bank waits for them to get arrested and then asks their family to perhaps sell their home or take out a loan to pay to release their child from the prison where they've been detained.
And Interpol, to my naive mind, should be pursuing across national borders the big baddies, the big criminals who've committed all sorts of terrible offences. Should Interpol be a small-time debt collection service for a pretty questionable regime in the Gulf?
Well, it's actually an abuse of the Interpol system to be reporting or misreporting debts under the category of fraud. Now, Interpol doesn't actually do any checks and balances when they receive a notice. They immediately publish it and rely on the issuing country to take the whole system seriously. Now, unfortunately, Qatar has invested a significant amount into Interpol, so they're less likely to want to contest or argue with their biggest donors.
Oh, dearie me, that sounds a right mess, doesn't it? Radha, great to speak to you. That's Radha Stirling, founder of IPEX, an NGO seeking reform, as you can hear, of Interpol.
And we can also speak to John Glendinning, who's Brian's brother. He's also fighting against his extradition, of course. Morning to you, John.
Morning.
How much contact have you had with Brian?
We have had some contact when this first happened. Obviously, for Brian to inform my mother and father first. And my mum and dad phoned me. That was on Monday the 12th of September. I've spoke to him on and off on a few occasions, but since he was moved from Basra to Baghdad, the communication has dropped quite a bit. We still have some communication through, we have an Iraqi lawyer, so we have some communication, but no, it's not hardly seeing or speaking with Brian and wondering how Brian's mental health, all this is going on, you know.
Yeah. And what did he say about his mental health the last time you spoke to him? I mean, how much of that can you share with us anyway?
Just he's constantly thinking the same as us, that we're not going to see each other, you know, and the way that Radha explains that we're fighting for Brian not to be extradited, because if extradited, he will serve the 2 years in jail, but then he'll be held more or less like a prisoner within the country until, you know, I'm already sold my car at the moment because we're trying to fight this, but legal fees with lawyers in Iraq, etc. We're sitting at £30,000 just now to fight ultimately what could have maybe been £10,000 or £15,000 loan. But if Brian goes to Qatar, that loan, like Radha said, is going to be a lot more than £30,000 now. So we've got our GoFundMe, and thanks to everybody so far. But GoFundMe is only for legal fees. We would never ask anyone to pay the loan. We wouldn't do that. It's just to fight to get Brian home. And once home, back in the UK, we'll happily communicate with Qatar and pay the loan.
What about help from the government? Can they help you?
I think so, yeah. I mean, James Cleverly, Liz Truss, I think these kind of people, we need their help. We really need the UK government to reach out to Qatar and reach out to Iraq, talk with them. I know we've got UK celebrities promoting the World Cup that's coming up, and I worry for fellow UK citizens who are going to be travelling over here in the coming weeks, if they're willing to do this to a gentleman who's missed payments on a loan. Wouldn't like to think what they do to someone that maybe, I don't know, it's with alcohol involved, etc. I would just think it's a big concern, and I just hope everybody really considers where they're going.
Do you think that kind of perversely almost the attention that there is on Qatar because of the World Cup might help a little bit?
I'm really hoping that's one of the biggest strategies now is that, okay, we have the Iraqi lawyer, and there's only so much he can do at his end because ultimately it's Qatar that's put Brian on the red list. So I'm hoping with what's coming up in Qatar, they wouldn't want any negativity towards World Cup and a British national being held. And like Radha said, not the first one, and sadly it doesn't sound like it'll be the last. I'm really hoping support, media attention, and as much as possible, and this can hopefully bring my brother home.
Well, we hope so too. John, we'll keep in touch with you and see what happens with the case. That's John Glendinning, who is the brother of Brian Glendinning, who's fighting extradition from Iraq to Qatar.
He has a loan outstanding in Qatar, shows up in Iraq and gets put in prison, and then you're going to be extradited to Qatar. That's a real mess, isn't it? And we'll see if that gets fixed. But if you can imagine, I'm not sure whether, Qatar wants to really sports wash its reputation, doesn't it? That's the reason Qatar spent this money. That's the reason everyone's rolled over and allowed them to do this. They shouldn't be hosting the World Cup, I don't think, but they've been allowed to, presumably because they want everyone to think everything is jolly and rosy there. So maybe, as you say, Asma, the attention might lead to them doing something because they don't want the grief. But we'll see what happens. It is now 8:33.